He had everything money could buy: power, luxury, influence, but not a single real connection. That night he walked into a crowded restaurant, distracted, uninterested. Ready to leave just like every other night, but one small mistake changed everything. He sat at the wrong table, and across from him was a woman who didn't care who he was, a single mother who had already learned the hard way that men like him only bring trouble. He wasn't supposed to stay, she wasn't supposed to matter, but in just a few moments something neither of them expected began to unfold. He was a billionaire, the kind of man people whispered about in rooms he hadn't even entered yet: private jets, luxury penthouses, endless business deals. His life looked perfect from the outside, but behind all that wealth was a man who trusted no one. Every smile felt fake. Every relationship came with a price tag. And every time someone said they cared, it was never really about him. So he stopped believing in love, stopped believing in anything real, until that night, because sitting across from him was someone completely different. She wasn't dressed to impress. She wasn't trying to get his attention. In fact, she barely even looked at him. Her focus was on her child, making sure they ate first, smiling through exhaustion, hiding the weight of a life that had been anything but easy. She was a single mother, someone who had fought battles he couldn't even imagine. She didn't need a billionaire. She didn't want one either, and that's exactly what made him notice her. For the first time in years, someone wasn't interested in his money, his name, or his power. She saw him as just another man sitting at her table, and in that moment, something shifted, because what started as a simple mistake was about to turn into something neither of them could walk away from. The restaurant was louder than he expected, filled with clinking glasses, quiet laughter, and the kind of warmth he hadn't felt in years. He barely noticed any of it. His mind was still buried in numbers, deals, and the endless pressure of being the man everyone depended on, but no one truly knew. When the host hurriedly guided him through the crowded space, apologizing for the delay, he didn't even look up. He just nodded and followed, assuming everything was handled like it always was. "Right this way, sir." He sat down without thinking. It wasn't until a small voice broke through his thoughts that he realized something was wrong. "Mom, who is he?" He looked up. Across from him sat a woman, her posture stiff, her eyes sharp with confusion and immediate suspicion. Beside her, a young child clutched a spoon, staring at him like he didn't belong there, because he didn't. For a second, no one spoke. Then the woman exhaled, clearly irritated. "I think you're at the wrong table." He glanced around, noticing for the first time that there was no empty chair, no privacy, no distance, just this small, intimate space he had accidentally stepped into. But instead of standing up immediately, something made him pause. "Looks like I am," he said calmly. She waited for him to leave. He didn't. There was an awkward silence, the kind that usually made him uncomfortable, but this time it felt different, real, unfiltered. "I can move," he added, though he made no effort to stand. She studied him carefully, as if trying to figure out his angle. Men didn't just sit at strangers' tables without a reason. Especially not men like him. Though she didn't know who he was yet, she could tell he wasn't ordinary. "Yeah," she said flatly. "You probably should," but the child spoke again, cutting through the tension. "It's okay, Mom, he can sit." That small, unexpected permission shifted everything. The woman sighed, clearly exhausted, like she didn't have the energy to argue over something so small. "Fine," she muttered, though her guard didn't drop for a second. And just like that, a mistake turned into a moment. At first, the conversation was barely there. A few exchanged glances, short answers, silence filling the gaps. But then he noticed something he hadn't seen in a long time. She wasn't trying to impress him. She didn't care how he looked, what he wore, or the quiet authority he carried. Her attention was entirely on her child, making sure they ate, wiping their hands, offering soft reassurances that stood in sharp contrast to the cold distance he was used to in his own world. "You should eat too," he said at one point, noticing her untouched plate. She gave a small, almost defensive smile. "I will," but she didn't. Instead, she kept focusing on her child, as if their needs came first in every possible way. And something about that, something simple, something ordinary, hit him harder than he expected. "You always do that?" he asked. "Do what? Make sure everyone else is okay before yourself?" Her expression changed slightly, like she hadn't expected him to notice. "That's what you do when you don't have a choice." There was no self-pity in her voice, just truth, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't know what to say. The more they spoke, the more his usual instincts faded. He wasn't calculating, wasn't analyzing, wasn't trying to control the conversation like he did in boardrooms and negotiations. He was just there, listening, and she, despite her guarded tone, slowly let pieces of her story slip through, not everything, not all at once, but enough. Life hadn't been kind to her. She had trusted the wrong person once, paid the price, and learned quickly that relying on anyone else was a risk she couldn't afford anymore. Everything she had built on her own. And everything she cared about was sitting right beside her. "You don't seem like someone who belongs here," she said suddenly. He raised an eyebrow. "What does that mean? You look like, I don't know, like someone who has better places to be." He almost smiled at that, if only she knew. "Maybe I don't," he replied. But time has a way of revealing things. Over the next few days, something strange happened. He came back. At first, it was easy to pretend it was coincidence, a meeting nearby. A convenient stop, but deep down he knew the truth. He wasn't there for the food, he was there for her. And each time the walls she had built didn't fall, but they cracked just enough for him to see more. More honesty, more strength, more vulnerability hidden beneath years of disappointment. He never mentioned his wealth, not at first. For once he wanted to be seen without it, but the truth doesn't stay hidden forever. The moment she found out, everything changed. It wasn't dramatic, there was no loud scene, no public confrontation. Just a shift in her expression, a quiet realization that turned into something colder. "You should have told me," she said, her voice steady but distant. "I was going to." When? He didn't have an answer that satisfied her, and that was enough. "People like you don't just forget to mention something like that," she continued. "You chose not to. It didn't matter. It matters to me." There it was. The line between their worlds, clear and unmovable. "You think I've never met someone like you before?" she asked. "Someone who pretends to be simple, down to earth, until you realize it was all just an act." It wasn't an act. Then what was it? He hesitated, and that hesitation cost him everything. "I can't do this," she said, stepping back. "I don't have time for games. I don't have the luxury of believing in something that isn't real." "It is real," he said, more firmly than before. "This, what we had, it was real." She shook her head, not angry, not emotional, just certain. "Not for me." And just like that, she walked away. For the first time in years, he didn't feel powerful. He didn't feel in control. He felt lost because she hadn't rejected his money. She had rejected him. The days that followed were different, quieter, empty in a way that no amount of success could fill. He went back to his world, to the deals and the decisions, but something had shifted. None of it felt the same, so he did something he had never done before. He stopped trying to prove himself with what he had and started proving himself with who he was. No grand gestures. No overwhelming displays of wealth, just small, consistent actions that carried meaning, being present, being honest, being real in a way he had never allowed himself to be. And slowly, carefully, she noticed, not because he was a billionaire, but because he wasn't acting like one anymore. The turning point didn't come from him, it came from her child. Because children see things adults try to ignore, and sometimes they remind us of what matters most, and in that quiet realization, something inside her began to shift too. Not completely, not instantly, but enough to make her question whether she had walked away from the wrong thing or the right one. She didn't go back to the restaurant the next day. Or the day after that. At first, she told herself it was because she was busy, because life didn't pause for confusion or complicated emotions. There were bills to pay, responsibilities to handle, a child who depended on her for everything. She had spent years building a life where she didn't need anyone else, and she wasn't about to let that fall apart now. But the truth was harder to ignore. Something had changed. Not because he was rich, not because of anything he could offer her, but because for a brief moment she had felt something real, and that was the part that scared her the most. Meanwhile, he didn't disappear. He didn't flood her with messages or try to force his way back into her life. Instead, he stayed exactly where he had always been, quietly showing up not to chase her but to prove that he wasn't going anywhere. Not for attention, not for control, but because he cared. And eventually, life did what it always does. It created a moment she couldn't ignore. It was small, simple, but powerful. Her child saw him first. "Mom, he's here." She turned, her heart instantly racing in a way she couldn't control. And there he was, not in a suit, not surrounded by people. Just standing there, looking unsure for the first time since she had met him. "I'm not here to convince you," he said quietly. "I just didn't want to walk away without being honest." She crossed her arms, holding on to the last pieces of her guard. "And what's that supposed to change?" "Nothing," he admitted. Unless you want it to. There was no pressure in his voice, no expectation, just truth, and that's what made it different. For the first time, she wasn't looking at a billionaire. She was looking at a man who had chosen to stay when it would have been easier to leave. Her child reached for his hand without hesitation, breaking the silence in a way only innocence could. And in that moment, something inside her softened, not because she suddenly trusted him completely, but because she realized something important. He wasn't perfect, he wasn't from her world. But he was real, and sometimes that's enough. She took a slow breath, then finally spoke. "One chance," she said, "that's all you get." He didn't smile right away. He just nodded, understanding the weight of those words, because this wasn't about money, it wasn't about status. It was about showing up again and again until she believed it. And as they walked forward, not into a perfect ending, but into something uncertain and honest, it became clear that the biggest mistake of his life was actually the moment everything finally made sense. Because sometimes love doesn't come from the right place. Sometimes it begins at the wrong table.